Coming up, we're going to continue our conversations about the state of the NatWest banking institution, NatWest Bank Group. Currently, the shares still down about 3%, just over 3%, trading at the lowest in the FTSE 100 at the moment as a result of all of the shenanigans that are going on. Dame Alison Rose, of course, admitted mistakes over the Farage furore, as we're calling it. She resigned in the very early hours of this morning, just about half a day since the NatWest Bank actually said that they had great confidence in her, and they didn't think that she should leave her job despite the fact that she had made a gross error of judgment. It's an extraordinary story. NatWest are still under the cosh. Nigel Farage is calling for the entire board to be sacked, and there's likely to be a meeting sometime this week between a lot of different banks, and including the government's representative for the shareholders, who own, of course, 30% or thereabouts, 39% I think, of NatWest shares on behalf of taxpayers, after we rescued them from the financial crash of 2008. It's extraordinary. Let's talk to Annabel Denham, who's Deputy Comment Editor at the Telegraph. Annabel, very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Mike.
This story is quite unbelievable. I know that we've been dealing with it now for a couple of weeks, but it's finally taken, I think, until today for Keir Starmer to say something about it. But NatWest have got absolutely everything wrong, and I think that's the thing that staggers me the most. You know, it's not so much that that Dame Rose actually resigned finally, or was asked to quit, but the fact that every single step of the way, when they could have got it right, they got it wrong.
That's right. I think banks, I'm afraid, Mike, have a pretty long history of terrible PR. It certainly goes back to the global financial crisis. And I think one of the ways in which they tried to deal with that was this focus on things like ESG and D&I, and essentially trying to become ideological entities rather than financial ones in some attempt to restore their reputations. But of course, all that has done is led us to the situation that we are currently in. And I don't think, you know, it's necessarily going to be limited to NatWest. I think the resignation of Alison Rose as CEO of the bank throws up as many questions as it answers. You know, how wide does this go? How many people have been affected by this? We know, of course, about Nigel Farage because he is, you know, such a public person with a big profile who is able to raise awareness. But how many other people have been debanked on account of views that they hold that are probably quite mainstream, but are viewed by some people working at banks as bigoted? So I think, you know, there needs to be some kind of thorough investigation into all of this, led by the government, which actually does provide, I think, a rare political opportunity for Rishi Sunak. He needs to get out there now and really make it clear to the British public that this is not acceptable. It's not something the Conservative Party are going to stand for, that they're going to review the legislation that was brought in that led us into this situation, and to make absolutely clear that people cannot be financially excluded in this way on account of views that they might hold.
No, exactly right. But also there's sort of insidiousness about all of it as well, in the way that the wokists have kind of inveigled their way into positions of power. I mean, we heard this morning that she was also a member of some committee in the net zero department of the government. She was an advisor to Downing Street in that capacity, and in another capacity to Rishi Sunak in some other role. And, you know, suddenly you think to yourself, well, this woman was put in charge of NatWest not because of her alacrity and her brilliance at banking, but because she was vowing to make it less sexist and more inclusive. And, you know, they've taken their eye off the ball to such an extent that they've forgotten what they're supposed to actually do for a living.
That's absolutely right. It's so pervasive now, Mike. After Alison Rose was appointed the first female chief executive of RBS in 2019, she announced that tackling climate change would be a central pillar of her leadership. Yeah. Not, you know, trying to maximise returns for shareholders, do the best that she possibly could for her clients, but actually focus, you know, almost relentlessly on issues like climate change. And I think this is, you know, not exclusive to banking, far from it. I think we have woke corporations up and down the country now. In fact, we have them across the West, where things like having a social purpose, governance, diversity, inclusion, all of these sorts of issues are being made primary at the expense of actually making a profit. And, you know, it was the great economist Milton Friedman who came up with the Friedman doctrine, which holds that the social responsibility of business is to increase its profit. And in doing so, show businesses are bringing social purpose, and that is really what they ought to be focusing on now, rather than becoming so fixated on all of these other areas. Now, I have to say that the government needs to be held to account for this as well, because a lot of the time businesses are responding to the regulatory frameworks in which they operate, where they are ranked and judged according to how well they perform in areas like diversity, and all of these sort of arm's length bodies that have developed over the last few years that are incentivizing this kind of behavior. And we need a complete correction now. And I suppose one hope that we can have from this NatWest saga is that it finally brings one about. But, we've got to ask, how it is that they've been captured like this by woke ideologies. We need to ask, why it was that the board was supporting Alison Rose until very recently. What about the Coutts board as opposed to the NatWest board? Because Coutts is corporate and a separately incorporated bank with its own banking license. And I suppose there is also a question as to why it is that Alison Rose resigned. Was it because they had debanked Nigel Farage, or was it actually because she breached confidentiality? Because those are two separate issues, and it's actually very important that we get to the bottom of it. So I think it's incredible, really, in some ways, that this story has been running since the end of June. Nigel Farage first made clear to the world that he had been debanked, but I think actually it's still got a long way to go.
Oh, I think so, because let's face it, if it wasn't for Nigel Farage actually announcing that it had happened, we probably still wouldn't know about it, because ever since that day, we've learned from all sorts of people that it's happened to them as well. I was listening last night to Ed Vasey, who was on First Edition, talking about various MPs that he knows who have had problems with their banks because they're MPs, and that their families have had problems because they're related to an MP. And they're using these kind of political, rather loose-worded kind of constructs to say, well, you might be a person at risk, and we might think that you are a person, and most of them seem to be those who you would regard as slightly on the right. So the idea that this committee that she set up, that Dame Rose set up, the Wealth and Reputational Risk Committee, or whatever it's called, surely that should be disbanded, and they should say we no longer are able to do these kinds of dossiers on people, because she, as you say, may have broken data protection laws. She certainly broke confidentiality. She may have even broken a European law, which apparently recommends that you cannot stop somebody from having a bank account based on their political belief. So she might have even actually broken real laws.
We just don't know what we don't know at this stage. But like I say, I think there's going to be a lot more that does come out. And there's clearly a fundamental flaw with these PEP regulations. As is so often the case, we've introduced a law. That law has been misused. The unintended consequences weren't foreseen. And it probably hasn't even achieved what it set out to do to begin with. But as I say, I think it's been massively abused. It's interesting, this Wealth and Reputational Risk Committee at the bank that didn't seem to fully appreciate how risky it would be to treat Nigel Farage like this. There was some awareness at the bank, I believe, that he had a big public profile, that he might, he goes out on social media, he has his own television show, that he might make this public, but they didn't seem to regard that as the threat that it quite clearly was going to be. So I think I imagine there's a lot of head scratching going on. And to go back to your original point, I think banks have just been very bad at communications and public relations. This is one example of that.
Yeah, and just going back to our own sort of shareholding in it, I mean, was that ever supposed to be open-ended? Was it supposed to be a shareholding that we got the money back out of at some point? I mean, what's the status of that, as far as you know?
Well, obviously, it's still nearly 40% owned by essentially the British public. It was 80% after the global financial crisis. The idea, of course, is that the British public will own less and less of the bank, and it's not exactly being held accountable to us. I think that actually it put the government in a very difficult position where it wasn't sure whether it should be intervening or not, because 40% of the bank was state-owned. What kind of communication was it having with the board, or to have been more involved or less. It seemed not to want to have any interference in this matter. And I think that has added another layer of complexity to it. But no, you're right. There's a question about, who they are accountable to, how much, of this bank ought to be state-owned, or should we just have let it go bust after the global financial crisis? Has it actually delivered? What has it achieved for the British public in the intervening period? And I think there's a wider question about what the purpose of banks is at the moment, because it seems with ever-mounting regulations that all they're doing is taking an extremely risk-averse position and doing a lot of box ticking. And are they actually delivering, the profits they could be and the shareholder returns that they could be? Or have they just been so coward that essentially they're just sort of living from one day to the next? So no, I think there's so many questions that need to be asked about that as well.
Exactly right. One of the things they did achieve was in 2021. December the 13th, they were fined £265 million for failing to stop drugs gangs from laundering bin bags stuffed with cash through a variety of branches up and down the country. So, I mean, they haven't even been doing the proper due diligence on those accounts, never mind, stopping politicians from being able to operate.
No, that's right. And it's all this money laundering regulations, it's KYC, know your customer, know your client regulations, a lot of which we've inherited from the US, but that feeds into these PEP regulations. And, like I say, they just don't seem to be being enforced where they should be. They're not acting as a significant enough deterrent. So we do get examples of massive money laundering or fraud. And yet it's also at the same time being abused by certain staff who are working within these sorts of institutions and have maybe are setting the terms of contracts and see an opportunity in which they are able to debank or stop somebody from being a customer if that person does not hold the views that they deem to be appropriate, the right views. And this is just an absolutely massive problem now that we have in the British economy, and we wonder why it is that we've got very low growth, why we've got very low productivity. Well, the answer, or at least one of the answers, is that we have so many people who are either adhering to regulations or pushing for more regulations. We have ever expanding HR departments. We have people who seem to believe that the moral purpose that they might have and retaining the moral high ground is more important than trying to than the bottom line and trying to get a profit. And it's such a big problem. It
really is. Stay with us, Annabel, if you would. We've got some more things to talk about, including record numbers of children who are apparently homeless in England, according to a report. And what about the rise of the net zero backlash and how that's going to go, particularly in business? This is TalkTV.